There have been over 300 comments across the handful of videos we've posted at the time of recording. It's only been 5 weeks, I think, since we posted our first video. The public support and interest has been absolutely amazing. We can't thank you all enough. So what I wanted to do was create a video that goes through these comments category by category to discuss them with you all, because I think the support and, more importantly, constructive criticism and feedback you've been providing is invaluable for this design process. So let's go through these types of comments we're getting and see if we can unpack some of the logic behind our game design choices. Does the game have a death spiral? So before we go into this, for those that don't know what a death spiral is, a death spiral in a game is where each time you get wounded or injured or hit, you get a little worse. You maybe get a penalty to your rolls, or your stats go down, or the die you use shrinks. And what this means is you are worse at defending yourself from subsequent attacks, which makes it more likely that you get wounded, which then lowers your stats again, which makes you even more likely to get wounded. And you see how we spiral downward, eventually just leading to death. And death spirals aren't fun because the players don't feel like they have a lot of control over what's going on. They just feel like it gets less fun the longer they play. So this was a very astute point to bring up in the comments. A number of people have that it's a concern with any wound or injury based game that it will devolve into a death spiral and the players will just feel like it's inevitable that they just die. So how did we avoid a death spiral in Tales from Elsewhere? Well, we do use injuries and they can make you worse at things, but one of the key differences is that each injury in Tales from Elsewhere can be treated and the penalties from it removed individually. So you don't have to wait for a downtime to get rid of the super painful gunshot wound in your leg that's making you less accurate from being in such agony. You can treat that in the moment, in that scene, and remove those penalties. Now, it still fills up your injury tracker, but filling up the injury tracker itself doesn't impart any penalties. It does mean that it's more likely that a more severe injury will be inflicted on you when you do get injured, but it doesn't actually make you worse at defending yourself. You still have all the options available to you to defend. We wanted the injuries to be evocative in the moment. And that means that in the scene in which you get them, that's when the injury should be most relevant. And then you can triage that based on whether or not you feel the need to get rid of that injury or can wait. And we found that this helps avoid the death spiral because the players control how long that injury remains on them, really, how long they're going to let that impediment stand before they treat it using a consumable or making a skill test to get rid of it. The other aspect of this combat system that helps avoid a death spiral is it's actually assumed that players aren't injured all that frequently. It's not like you're constantly butting heads and trading injuries against your enemies. The players have a lot of tools to avoid being injured in the first place, and because the game is quite deadly, they can take down their enemies very quickly as well with coordination. And what this means is that there's not a lot of exchange between the players and the enemies. Things move quickly, and the enemy's ability to fight back is dismantled in a very quick fashion if the players are coordinating together and playing tactically, of course. Now, that's not to say that these constructive criticisms about death spirals are inaccurate or unwarranted. It's absolutely a concern we've had in development for a long time, and we'll continue to iterate on leading up to the launch. And as we release more and more playtest documents and information to you all, we'd love to hear more about whether or not the death spiral feels bad. Because in an action horror game, the players are supposed to be a little de-empowered, right? This isn't a heroic fantasy we're trying to accomplish, but something a little bit more visceral and dire and dangerous, where the players do feel jeopardized and imperiled. But we'll have to keep an eye on it, so thank you all for everybody who commented about death spirals, as it's good to keep our eye on it. Is the injury tracking cumbersome or inconvenient to use for both the players and the GMs? Well, we found that it hasn't been too bad, but I can see how it would look like it would be a ton of writing and erasing, filling in all of these injuries and their descriptions and complications. But the reality is that you're not actually receiving very many of these in a given fight. The players often will go a whole fight without receiving any injury. And that's because the players have a lot of tools to avoid those injuries in the first place, but that threat of being injured creates a lot of tension, can be very scary. And something I didn't make clear in the other video talking about injuries is you don't actually erase those injuries until you have downtime. They stick on that character sheet, on that tracker, until you can go and rest and are back in a safe haven of some sort. So you're not actually erasing them frequently. When you treat an injury, you just check a little box next to it to note that it is treated, and then the complications associated with that injury are ignored. So if you get a gunshot wound, you can treat the bleeding part of that injury and you'll no longer be bleeding, but you don't actually erase it from the sheet. So you're not adding and removing these frequently. They slowly accumulate over time, and that represents, your body being worn down. But you're not actually having to erase straight through the character sheet. Now, on the Game Master's side, being able to track this for multiple enemies, we're actually still working on the best user experience to do so. I'm working on some trackers or notation that would make this easier, because it is right, if you are having to track 6 to 7 different injuries across several different enemies, that could be quite burdensome, and we're working on the user experience for that at the moment. So stay tuned on how we address that, because that is a very valid concern. Something to consider is that think about how much arithmetic and writing you have to do in a traditional hit point based game like Dungeons and Dragons, how much erasing and rewriting your hit points and temp HP and healing goes on. And think about the Dungeon Master and how much they're tracking all this different math. I'm sure those of you who've run it or played it, you'll have all these little notes about how much HP each enemy has left, and it's actually quite a bit of writing, and you don't do as much writing as that in Tales from Elsewhere, oddly enough. Yeah, that what you need to write down is more verbose, right? Because it's a description in severity and a complication. But you're doing it so infrequently that it's actually wearing through that pencil a little slower. Is the game slow to play? Is all of the minutia you're tracking, all the injuries and the called shots, does that bog the game down? And we found that it doesn't bog the game down, no, but the game plays at a different speed. Not faster or slower, but it's a different way than other games. And part of that is with the shared turn, the players all work together to accomplish one thing, mixing and matching their actions, coordinating their strikes. So that one shared turn takes longer to resolve than, say, one player's normal turn in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, but a lot happens during that time. And more importantly, all the players remain more engaged during that shared turn because they're able to contribute and discuss and assist more like a team than a group of people just individually waiting for their turn to come up. Additionally, with the game's emphasis on reactions, yeah, that's a lot to resolve round by round, but it actually means everybody remains engaged during that whole time. Just because it's not the player's turn doesn't mean they aren't reacting, diving for cover, blocking things, rolling dice, and using abilities. And this makes the whole gameplay experience more engaging. It's less of you sitting there and waiting for your turn to come up, or maybe you get attacked by an enemy and you just write down the hit point difference. The whole team of players and the GM are more involved in the whole experience, both the player turn and the threat turn. Another thing going for Tales from Elsewhere is that how hard it is for the players to accomplish things, the difficulty they need to meet or beat with their skill test, is known to the players. It's all player facing. They can calculate how hard it is to pull out their revolver and shoot at a bandit based on how far away it is and where they're targeting. They don't actually need to have that confirmation from the Game Master before proceeding. Really, the Game Master is just there to resolve the injuries, but the players can take a lot of ownership of their turn, and that helps expedite things. It creates less of a back and forth. Interestingly, just the day before I recorded this, I ran a 6-person demo of Tales from Elsewhere, the Clockworld setting, and it is the demo that we'll be releasing hopefully very soon. But 6 players is a lot with such a complicated game, and despite that, we nailed it in the 4-hour time window I was hoping for to run through this demo adventure that has all sorts of scenes and fights and carnage going on in it and roleplay. And even with that large group of players, only one of which had actually played the game previously, the combat flowed nicely, everybody was able to contribute, they caught on right away. They had played things like Dungeons and Dragons before, And so they weren't strangers to tabletop role-playing games, but I think that was a good indication that the game does proceed at a good pace, because with that many players, we did get through quite a bit of content. Is Tales from Elsewhere's injury system just a copy-paste of Blades in the Dark's harm system? Well, short answer is no. I think there's a lot of distinction between the two, and I'd like to unpack that because I'm a big fan of Blades in the Dark. I own a copy of it, I think it's wonderful, but what it's using its harm system for and how it actually plays, I think is very different, and let's break that down. So John Harper, who created Blades in the Dark, is absolute genius, of course. He, I think, contributed one of the most substantive additions to tabletop role-playing games in many years. You know, now you have all sorts of games that are forged in the dark, like Powered by the Apocalypse. I think his contribution cannot be overstated here. So let's define very briefly what harm is in Blades of the Dark, so then we can compare and contrast to Tales from Elsewhere. So harm is one of several complications that the GM can inflict on the players when they fail a roll. So the complications in Blades in the Dark are things like, oh, you tripped an alarm, so now the guards are more on alert, or maybe the bad guy got away, or maybe you've lost your position, you no longer can effectively skirmish against them because they're up on the balcony. It's just one of those things that they can use to penalize the players and give them setbacks to work through. And harm specifically represents things that wear your body and mind down, that make you more likely to die or need to retire. One example they give in Blades in the Dark is that if you stay up all night studying, you might be drained the next day, and that would be added to your harm tracker, because it represents the wearing down of your spirits or your ability to defend yourself. And that would be right alongside things like getting stabbed. All of that would be added to your harm tracker. So this harm tracking is just another tool for the GM to create these setbacks and challenges for the players specifically. It's worth noting that in Blades of the Dark, the players don't inflict harm on the NPCs and enemies. That's not how that works. Because in Blades in the Dark, and one of the beauties of the system, is that all resolutions, whether violent or otherwise, are using the same structure and can result in the same types of complications. It's really up to the GM to use the tools available to them for the narrative. But when the players attack things, the GM is not writing in harm boxes and filling those in for their opponents. It's a completely asymmetrical system, which works very well for Blades in the Dark. So in Tales from Elsewhere, the injury tracker is much more narrow in how it's used. Blades in the Dark, it can be used to represent a lot of things, but in Tales from Elsewhere, the injuries are physical injuries. They are the visceral and brutal maiming you will receive as you try to survive the ruination. And that's on purpose. It's meant to evoke something a little bit more gnarly, I guess you could say, because we're going for action horror here rather than espionage like in Blades in the Dark. Additionally, in Tales from Elsewhere, each of those injuries is bespoke. Each enemy might inflict very special types of injuries, or each weapon will say the types of complications it will inflict with those injuries, and that's part of the combat engine, is these injuries and their complications. It's very much the focus of it, rather than being simply part of the greater machine of complication that harm uses in Blades in the Dark. Now, I think we could actually spend a lot of time talking about Blades in the Dark and their harm system and the genius of the way complications work, and then comparing it to Tales from Elsewhere. But the last point I want to make on this subject before we wrap it up is that Tales from Elsewhere is using a symmetrical injury system for its combat resolution. The players are also inflicting those injuries on the enemies, and those enemies have varying sized injury trackers that they use. So it is a symmetrical system where both sides are tearing each other up in the same way. It's a more traditional combat system in that manner, and that's not to say that traditional or more creative ones are better or worse, it's just different and serving a different purpose in Tales from Elsewhere. Isn't the injury system in Tales from Elsewhere just an attrition-based system with a different name? Maybe, I guess. We might be getting into semantics here, but I did see this feedback a lot, so I want to talk through it. I want to express my opinions on that subject, as I don't think it's an unfair thing to say. When I'm talking about attrition-based combat, how I'm using that term is to refer to that feeling of butting heads with an opponent and simply trading hit point damage with each other. You know, the knight versus the dragon. The knight will do 10 to 15 points of damage to the dragon one turn. The dragon will hit him and do 20 points of damage. But nothing's really changed in the fight apart from their hit point totals going up or down in any given round. And that sort of gameplay I find uninspired. Now, of course, you can create more interesting mechanics in a fight, you can create objectives, you can make things exciting, any good dungeon master will, but the goal with a system like Tales from Elsewhere's injury system is to make that exchange more meaty, more evocative, and to give both the players and the GMs more tools for making those exchanges not only more narratively interesting, but more mechanically interesting and impactful. And it's important to note that with the injury system in Tales from Elsewhere, just like in Blades in Dark's harm system, you can jump ahead of the line. You don't have to build up these minor injuries until you get a more major injury. You can immediately get a serious or critical injury on the opponent and immediately impact them in a very deadly way. And there's ways to instantly kill them in this way. No matter how many hit points they have, you can jump the line. And that means that it doesn't result in quite a stagnant progression of exchanges as there are spikes in lethality. The idea is that in the core resolution system, that core injury system, the players have more interesting decisions to make, apart from just I attack. It lets them dismantle an enemy. It creates these alternative ways to defeat something. You don't have to reduce their hit points to 0 or even kill them to thwart them. You can take away their ability to fight back. Maybe you're fighting a big old cybernetic undead monstrosity that has 3 limbs, one with a chainsaw, one with a grabby hand, and one with a syringe. If you take out all of those limbs, it can't effectively fight back anymore and you have defeated it. And that's something you can't do when you're just trading hit points in an attrition style way. At the end of the day, I think this question of what is attrition and what is not might be a bit too much of a semantics debate to be handled effectively over YouTube, but I don't want to disregard all of those comments that are stating that, because I think they are getting at something important, that in a lot of games it is always an exchange of blows at the end of the day, right? Somebody can only be hit so many times before they go down, and you can only be hit so many times before you go down. But a game like Tales from Elsewhere is trying to make that sequence more interesting, moment by moment, by giving the players and the monsters more dials to turn, more interesting decision tree branches to go down as the fight evolves, baked into the core system. Because it doesn't stop you from layering all of the good dungeon mastering knowledge on top of that, right? Adding all of the cool objectives and great descriptions and interesting narrative to the fight. You can still do all of that, but it helps when your core resolution already has a lot of mechanical and narrative juice to it that you just don't usually find with hit points. That was a long-winded video, I know. There was a lot to unpack, and really we could be standing here and talking endlessly about these subjects, I think. Now, if you do want to talk more about tabletop design, either in general or about Tales from Elsewhere, you can join the design Discord that I'm a part of that has hundreds of people in it, or join the Tales from Elsewhere Discord where there's a smaller group just talking about our game. Both of those links will be down below, and as always, I hope you like, subscribe, share this video. It's really helping us out. We are off to a great start, and we can't wait to share more with all of you. Thank you again.